Welcome to News from Neptune for November 1st in the 44th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's All Saints' Day, celebrated in some Christian churches. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a wrong reason edition of News from Neptune. What I have in mind is T.S. Eliot's remark or lines from Murder in the Cathedral, his play about the Archbishop and the King in the 12th century. The lines are, "The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason." Whatever you think of Eliot's reasoning there, and even of the political problems of a millennium ago, the fact of the matter is, it seems to me that American politics in the moment are preoccupied with doing the right deed, dismissing the president from his office, but for the wrong reason. What is being suggested is that Donald Trump be impeached and removed from office because of his departure from the standard neoliberal and neoconservative policies that every administration has followed for 40 years. That's no reason to dismiss Donald Trump. That's a reason to celebrate the things that have been advertised as the benefits of his presidency, that is, departure from neoliberal and neoconservative policies. The fact of the matter is, he's not departed from those policies. He continues to follow them, and the right reason to impeach and remove the president is those policies, as that would be the right reason to impeach and remove his predecessors. And not for the silly reasons that are being constantly misrepresented today about Ukraine. The real story of American involvement with Ukraine should be told, and of course you won't hear that in the standard media outlets. What happened there was that the Obama administration overthrew the government of Ukraine in order to attack Russian influence, and it did that by installing the first government since 1945 that had explicit Nazis in it. The backing of the Nazis in the Ukrainian government by the American government was certainly an impeachable crime on the part of the Obama administration. The machinations involving the dishonest, corrupt vice president of the United States and his son probably aren't. Every American president since the Second World War would suffer the final penalty, they'd be hanged, if the Nuremberg principles on which we hanged the Nazi leaders were enforced on them. The point was made by Chomsky a number of years ago, and unfortunately the presidencies, the administration since then have all qualified for punishment under the Nuremberg principles too, if we attend to it, and it's worthwhile attending to that to avoid the silly suggestions about American foreign policy in all recent administrations. So you're listening to a Wrong Reason edition of News from Neptune. It's the wrong reason to impeach Trump, but he surely should be impeached. What do you think, David?
I noticed Noam Chomsky grew his beard out.
Yeah. My suggestion is that in the Southwest he wants to play Santa Claus.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought maybe he wanted to look more like us.
Oh, that could be it.
That could be it.
Could be it.
But he heard about, News from Neptune, which of course is named after something that was said about him, not
Right.
by him, but about him. Let me just refer to a few things briefly, just to put it on the table, or at least get it out of the way so I don't wait till the end of the show. Paying college athletes. All I want to say about that is I thought when they started talking about paying college athletes, it was really going to be like paying a salary,
Right.
a much-deserved wage or salary to college athletes, and not pretending that they're getting paid by going to college free or getting their dorm rooms free. But as it turns out, all the proposals I'm hearing about, unless I'm missing something, have to do with marketing images of certain athletes, not of all of them, obviously, so that only some of them, only obviously the most marketable ones, the most skilled and well-known ones, can get ready to be pros by making some money before they're pros. And that's just another, I know it's silly, but it's like, what was this bait and switch all these years about paying them? And then when state legislators get around to passing laws that make it legal to pay them, they're not really getting paid. That's one thing.
Okay.
You have a comment on that?
Well,
you don't have to, but
there's so many things wrong from top to bottom about
Yes.
sports teams that are sponsored by academic institutions that it's hard to know where to begin. But the idea that the laborer is worthy of his hire seems to me to be the first point. College athletes sacrifice a lot. They're doing work for the university as much as a groundskeeper or a academic vice president are, and they should be paid for it.
Yeah, but just to stress that this isn't what we're reading about now.
No.
We're just reading about
whether they can make money by advertising.
Some of them making legal for them to get agents and make money.
Right.
And that might be all well and good and fair under our current system, but that's not dealing with the underlying problems. And of course, the whole system. It doesn't. When we start talking about the way campuses are working these days, the working class of students, the working class of graduate students, and the penurious, if that's the right word for the way people are dealt with in the midst of all of these six-figure salaries. I also wanted to mention I have talked about the article that I had on Counterpunch 3 or 4 weeks ago regarding the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing and Nicholas Kristof's column about it. I had wanted to just, for the record, mention one footnote to that article, and that is a woman who I linked to on the very last paragraph of that article, a woman named Harriet Fraad, Dr. Harriet Fraad, F-R-A-A-D, who is a psychotherapist in practice in New York City, and actually didn't know until recently she is the wife of Richard Wolff, the
economist.
And she does a podcast, or actually a YouTube video as well as podcast, underneath the rubric of the outfit that Richard Wolff is running called Democracy at Work. Richard Wolff does a podcast there. David Harvey does a podcast there called the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles every couple weeks or so. And Harriet Fraud has been doing a podcast for a few months now, a couple of times every month, called Capitalism Hits Home, in which she deals with issues relating to capitalism and the family. What could be, I think, fairly considered a radical feminist perspective. Say one, just to bring up a local name, one more advocated by maybe someone like Nina Paley, who has been controversial for various reasons that we've talked about on this program. And Harriet Fraud did do a series of programs about Jeffrey Epstein. They're about a half hour each, and there's 4 of them. I think she only intended to do 2 or 3 of them, but she kept having more things to say about the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and the ruling class in this country and the patriarchy of this country in this country, and they're well worth listening to. And in that light, I wanted to mention the sort of the ongoing controversy on this campus.
Remark about Epstein before you get to that?
Sure, of course.
The news this week was
Yes.
the medical examiner who says that, by the way, that rapid medical assessment that we got from the New York prisons probably is incorrect, that the indications from the physical evidence are that Epstein was strangled to death. What surprises me about it is there's been so little talk about what's going on in the American prison system that embarrassing people like the awful Jeffrey Epstein can be casually killed, and no one says, why didn't the prison prevent this? The complacency in which the American ruling class, which is apparently very much involved with Jeffrey Epstein, is able to make its run is disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, we of course don't know, and this report came out because one of Epstein's relatives got a report from some pathologist or some coroner or whatever that these injuries were more consistent with homicide than with suicide, and somebody disputed that. You know, in the article that I read, somebody disputed that. So it's being turned into a he said, she said kind of thing. But I don't see the media going after that in quite the same way that they go after Russiagate or for some strange reason.
Very good point.
Yeah. And so I have to admit, Carl, that even though I watched the movie Gaslight many years back, I guess I didn't really understand what gaslighting was until I started looking at that recently and realized that was what was going on, both with the article I wrote was about Nicholas Kristof basically displacing the focus from Jeffrey Epstein to allegedly thousands of men who have sex with underage prostitutes. And I made the same argument in my letter to the News Gazette that appeared yesterday regarding this campus and the manner in which all students or all males on this campus are being focused on by the campus administration as opposed to the faculty members who are using their authority in a disturbing patriarchal way to impose their sexual needs upon some of the women that they have authority over in an obviously inappropriate way, which was detailed in the paper this morning regarding Joe Petrie and has implicated one other faculty member. But again, Julie Wirth, the article by Julie Wirth yesterday, on the 30th, Wednesday, plunges right back into this sort of gaslighting business. It starts out a broad set of recommendations covering everything from student sexual assault to faculty-student relationships, at the University of Illinois is nearly complete and will be voted on next month by UI trustees. Notice that they put student sexual assault before faculty-student relationships. Down further in the article, they're referring to Barbara Wilson, one of the chancellors, talking about these two reports. Wilson said the two reports are complementary with an E. The campus committee focused primarily on faculty misconduct and consequences, he said. They went really deep in a particular area. Our task force, Wilson said, went much broader. So we're looking at education and training for faculty, students, and other employees. Something that's been going on, as I noted last week, for years and years, and probably has made a difference among the common people in terms of the way that they treat each other. Although now, again, with this report, and there was business with Kate Clancy, the anthropology professor, it has to be the ante has to be upped, where we're not just talking about sexual harassment anymore. We're talking about people saying rude things to each other, and how that ought to be policed on college campuses. And just a couple of more quotes from Julie Wirth's article from a couple of days ago. During a discussion at Tuesday's University Senate's conference meeting, Professor Nicholas Burbulis, who is a piece of work in his own right, said it's important to make a distinction between sexual harassment and consensual relationships. Who would have thought that it's important? Who but what a professor of education would have thought that it's important to make a distinction between sexual harassment and consensual relationships. These people are just brilliant. Burbulis continued on. These two broad areas really do raise very different kinds of issues. He's certainly right about that. We might, and then he continues, we might have a zero tolerance mentality in one domain that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate in the other domain. There are people who want to conflate them. Yes, he's right about that. He might ask why it is that people are conflating normal, everyday male, female, or even male, female behavior, as we found out in the case of Katie Hill, the deposed congresswoman from California, this past week. But still, this is all obscurantism. This is again gaslighting. We need to be talking about patriarchy in terms of men who have power over women and who misuse them, or even vice versa. And just one more tidbit, Carl, I just have to do this. The task force also hired a graduate student to review all the likely a poorly paid graduate student, I might add.
He should be an athlete.
To review all the literature on education and training programs, including what works and what doesn't. This was Barbara Wilson saying this again. Too often, she said, people don't pay much attention to that. It doesn't matter how many policies you have. If you don't educate and change the culture, you're just going to be in reactive mode all the time. And she goes on, we want to help people, including students, think about consent, relationships, et cetera, and have policies and practices that are way more transparent, that nip things early before they get out of hand, that help all of our stakeholders to be more proactive and thoughtful. And I just have to say, first of all, I feel sorry for this graduate student who has to review the quote unquote scholarly literature in this field, but they're never going to figure out what programs or what policies and practices work, because there's no way to really run controlled experiments on human beings and really measure what they've been exposed to and what their outcomes are. It's all kind of a fake social science thing. And they're just part of this big cloud of academic confusion around what are basic issues that we need to be talking about broadly on campuses in terms of why you have problems when some people have too much power and too much money and other people have very little power and very little money, how those relationships play out. So, Harriet Fraud's program is called Capitalism Hits Home, so she's talking about families. But let's just say this is about how capitalism hits schools and how it has been hitting schools really hard, higher ed especially, for the last 30 or 40 years.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. We'll shift now from a local problem, a problem that obviously has ramifications far beyond its local examples, to the question of U.S. war making. The first of President Trump's recent foreign policy steps was to withdraw the small U.S. contingent that was a deterrent to Turkey's expansion of its invasion of Syria, and to authorize Turkish President Erdogan's plans to extend his atrocities and ethnic cleansing of Syrian Kurds. The political situation is largely a result of American policy in the region, but there are a variety of other actors. Trump's second step was to move U.S. troops to secure the oil-producing areas. What a surprise. The latter, apparently after he was told about the oil, is easy to understand. He's held all along that our only standing interest in the Middle East is to secure, in quotes, its oil for our own benefit. There's a refreshing breath of criminal fresh air here, and that Trump is saying what has been the case, obviously, of American policy for generations, but presidents, Bush and Obama and others, have busily covered sin with smooth names, as the scriptures say, and talked about all the good that the U.S. was doing while it killed people in order to control the energy resources of the Persian Gulf. As for his first step, that's Trump's first step in the region, that is the withdrawing a small number of troops. This is the man who campaigned on withdrawing troops from the Middle East in the last presidential election. As for the first step, we can only speculate, but it seems quite likely that the motive is what guides him consistently. How will the action affect me? Since it's clear now that his opposition to American war in the Middle East helped to get him elected. Trump is an effective con man, better than being a bad con man, as some other presidents have been. Trump is an effective con man who has a good sense of what animates his voting base. In this case, he presumably expected, correctly it seems, that withdrawing of a few hundred troops would appeal to a sector of the population that resonates to his message that America is foolishly expending its blood and treasure to help unworthy people who don't even thank us for our sacrifices on their behalf, and that Trump is the first president to stand up for the suffering American people instead of giving everything away to foreigners out of stupidity or treachery. If you don't believe that this account resonates in the U.S. and indeed helped make Trump president, I think you've been listening to too much American media. It's worth recalling that repeated polls have shown that Americans vastly overestimate the scale of foreign aid and recommend that it be considerably higher than it actually is. Let's be clear on what's being said there. Americans think that the U.S. gives to other nations far more than it actually does, and we're not even questioning here of the terms of what, the form in what that aid is given, in which that aid is given. We're simply talking about the U.S. Support, ambiguous as it might be for other countries. Americans think that there's much more to that than there actually is, and Americans don't object to it. They think it's appropriate. The U.S. should indeed be supporting other countries. in the views of most Americans, but they're doing it in a way that is counter to what most Americans think that we're actually doing. So it's a double misleading approach on the part of American propaganda in that regard. Much has been written and said about the betrayal of the Kurds, a U.S. ally in the war against ISIS, the Islamic State. This is not, however, for those who've been paying attention, the first time that the U.S. has betrayed the Kurds and other former allies. Betrayal of the Kurds has been virtually a qualification for office since Ford and Kissinger abandoned the Kurds to the mercy of Saddam Hussein when the Kurds, are no longer needed. Reagan went so far as to support his friend Saddam's chemical warfare campaign against Iraqi Kurds, seeking to shift the blame to Iran and blocking congressional efforts to respond to those hideous crimes. Clinton's method was to provide the arms for the murderous government assault on Turkish Kurds, which killed tens of thousands, wiped out nearly 3,500 towns and villages, and drove hundreds of thousands from their homes. This is discussed in Noam Chomsky's book, The New Military Humanism, published in 1999, which described the reactions, the historic relations between the American government and the Kurdish people in the Middle East. Henry Kissinger defended his betrayal of the Kurds when they were no longer useful and necessary for American foreign policy in the area, and his subjecting them to the tender mercies of the then Shah of Iran by saying we should not confuse foreign policy with missionary work. That's Henry Kissinger, hardly surprisingly. Trump's contribution is particularly disgusting. The Kurds lost 11,000 soldiers, men and women, leading the war against ISIS, for which Trump claims credit. We defeated ISIS, said Trump, helped by some U.S. special forces. The 11,000 Kurds lost in that battle compare with the 5 casualties that U.S. Special Forces report from the same engagement. The American air support was much more important than the actual boots on the ground, as they say, although they were there. Erdogan demanded that Kurds, the president of Turkey, demanded that Kurds eliminate defensive fortifications, filling in trenches and things like that, near the border, and at the request of the U.S. command, they complied, trusting Washington's promise that it would protect them from a further Turkish assault. Trump's tweet broke that promise, leaving Kurds exposed to the invasion by Turkish-backed forces, most, it seems, jihadis and criminals, that is, the sorts of people that the Obama administration had been sending into Syria in order to overthrow the Syrian government. Those people were being supported by the United States, in this case, in the interest of Turkish control of the Kurdish regions. For years, Turkey has been helping tens of thousands of these jihadis to flood into Syria for its anti-Assad war and to establish a Turkish president. That's the strategy of the U.S. from the beginning, the attempt to find ways in which the regional forces can be used to establish a biddable government in Damascus, in Syria, a government which would be consistent with American plans for control of the region and particularly its oil resources. Trump's green light to the Turks then and now was for extending the operation with the alleged goal of ending a terrorist threat. In reality, in order to put an end to the highly promising social and political achievements in Kurdish-led Rojava by violence and terror, ethnic cleansing, and resettling the region with Syrians of Turkey's choosing. So the developments in the Kurdish regions, which were admired around the world, the U.S. naturally attempted to use for its own purposes and its own ongoing campaign against the Syrian government and the abandonment of the Kurds to the tender mercy of the Turks is nothing new. It's what the U.S. has done in regard to Turkish nationalism for a long time. The only difference now is that the Kurdish people in Syria had developed a community which did indeed attract admiration from the world at large and was not merely a stalking horse for American policy, as had been the case before. This is dead Kurds is a result of American policies in the region, and Trump, for all his notion that he is going to withdraw troops from the region, is in fact in this matter simply acquiescing to the sorts of geopolitics that the U.S. has exercised in the region for many a day, and the result, as usual, is corpses.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in, I think one of the best accounts, brief accounts of what's going on has been done in a video by Rania Khalek, who is working for, having been expelled from the respectable journalistic community, is over the whole Syria issue and over her criticism of the support for the quote-unquote moderate rebels in Syria, a la Max Blumenthal and Ben Norden and Aaron Mate and the whole gang. She is based in Lebanon now and working for a Russian outfit, I think an RT-related outfit called In the Now, and is producing videos both about what's going on in Syria generally, but also what is going on in the rebellion within Lebanon or in the protests within Lebanon right now. So I've been kind of tuned into her a little bit last week, over the last few days, both on the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure that she does, which she did one longer episode last weekend, and then a 25-minute episode just in the last day or two, with sort of ongoing reports about sorting out the forces within the Lebanese protests. But getting back to Syria, I think her 8-minute video is very. I think Jeffrey will be able to find it. I think you could access it through her Twitter account. That's a very good overview of what's going on. And on the other hand, you have all of this ongoing cynicism of the sort of the Lewis Project left, the Marx Mail left, the unrepentant Marxist left, and what Lewis keeps doing, other than Lewis likes to refer to Rania as depraved for her so-called support for Assad, but also what Louis Project actually did me a little bit of a favor, did maybe us a little bit of a favor this week. He has to resort to sort of neocon think tanks, including one called the Century Foundation, in order to prove his point. And he posted an article by a guy named Aron Lund, a Swedish fellow named Aron Lund, who is supported by this think tank, ARONLUND. And when I looked at what Aron Lund was doing, in the midst of all the arguments that are made that Lewis has always made, that the U.S. never really wanted to overthrow the regime in Syria, Aron Lund wrote an article back in October of 2017 in which included a summary with a few bullet points, which actually I think, and I'll defer to your judgment on this, but I think provides a really good summary in a kind of honest way that kind of counteracts what Lois Project has been arguing all these years. And it goes something like this: what you should know. Bullet point number 1. The United States led a large number of governments to establish the quote-unquote Friends of Syria group in 2012, confident that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would soon be toppled. Bullet point number 2. Between 2013 and 2017, the CIA funded, armed, and trained anti-Assad insurgents to the tune of several $billions, while facilitating thousands of tons of arms for the rebels' allies in Turkey, Europe, and the Gulf. But despite U.S. efforts, opposition backers never managed to coordinate, and their differing agendas helped deepen the splits in Syria's armed and civilian opposition. Bullet point 3. As the war dragged on, Assad proved more resilient than expected, and hardline Islamists came to dominate the insurgency. As early as 2013, many in the West had quietly given up on regime change. Bullet point 4. Years later, Washington is leading the way to a wider step down. Erstwhile patrons might continue limited support for Syrian proxies and issue pro forma calls for Assad's resignation, but the appetite for forced regime change is gone. Bullet point 5. I didn't even need to read that. It's just, okay. So 4 bullet points, more or less. I mean, all this time, Louis Project has been arguing that they never wanted regime change. And what Lund, somebody he refers to in trying to give the Marxist neocon version, his sort of peculiar Marxist neocon version, is basically, I think, laying it out pretty clearly. Don't you think?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
It sounds like it.
All right. So thank you, Aaron Lund. I don't like your website. I don't like the Century Foundation. There's another piece of work there named Thanasis Cannabis or something like that, who's written horrible things about Lebanon and Hezbollah, and is clearly a kind of a Zionist tool. But still, every so often, these people can actually, because they do the research, can actually end up saying something true, as long as they're sure it isn't going to offend the wrong people.
And you, as usual, you can't tell the players without a program. This program is News from Neptune, and we do what we can to distinguish the players, even when they're not exactly who we expect them to be. An example is the reporting of these issues and related issues, indeed issues across the world, of the present populist rebellion that's taking place in many forms around the world, on the BBC. The President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain sat together this week and talked about their mutual problems. In spite of their looks, they're not just clowns. They are, in fact, people who are capable of producing wretched circumstances for many around the world. The reports of this from the BBC have been important in this country because it's about the only major accounting from Britain that we get. And strangely enough, pointed out by our researcher Jeff Nicholson, the BBC has done something very peculiar recently, as peculiar as the tergiversations that David was just talking about. The BBC has made its website available on Tor, the onion router, sometimes called the dark web. Tor-hosted websites can use a top-level domain of .onion, which are reachable by anyone who uses the Tor network. To get on the Tor network, get the Tor browser, a modified version of Firefox that makes it easy to browse websites on the Tor network, from torproject.org, download. The BBC, the state-funded British media, has been noteworthy for not covering stories of great importance. Recently, the BBC has failed to keep up with Julian Assange stories, the head of WikiLeaks being persecuted, indeed tortured, according to the UN, by the US and the UK. The BBC has failed to keep up with Julian Assange stories, including his eviction from the Ecuadorian embassy, the exclusive coverage available to Americans and Brits too of that expulsion of the throwing of Julian Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy came from RT, the Russian equivalent of the BBC, who had the revolutionary idea of sending a camera down to the Ecuadorian embassy and taking a picture of whatever the British government was doing with Julian Assange, which included pulling him out bodily from the Ecuadorian embassy and throwing him into a maximum security prison. Nobody else covered it. RT covered it. The activities of RT pointed up the omissions by the BBC, which are not an accident. Journalist John Pilger described on the RT program to Afshan Ratansi, the RT reporter, what had happened. Ratansi said it didn't make Channel 4 News here, that is the expulsion or the imprisonment by the UK of Julian Assange. It made headlines around the world, but not news here in Britain. John Pilger said, no, it didn't make it. The BBC deliberately excluded the most important case. A publisher and journalist is brought to a court. He's convicted of nothing, charged in this country, Britain, with nothing. The charges against him are not only concocted, but as his counsel pointed out yesterday, the extradition treaty between Britain and the United States has a specific section in it that says a person cannot be extradited if the offenses are said to be political. 16 of the 17, at least, charges against Assange in the United States are unlawful. They're political. That's not opinion. That's not a piece of agitprop. They are under law political. They're based on a 1917 U.S. law called the Espionage Act, which was used to chase down conscientious objectors to war. That was what was originally established. It was used by later American governments to suppress critics of American wars. And interestingly enough, the law was used most in the period between its passing in the Wilson administration a century ago and the current time. It was used most by the Obama administration, which, in its typical fashion, suppressed the objectors to its war-making. RT had no particular access to Assange's activity. RT merely did what any journalist in the area could have done but chose not to, keep the cameras rolling and report on what they saw and heard. This is exactly what BBC and American news outlets were not doing. The footage BBC ran of Assange's eviction was licensed from RT's Ruppeley. That is to say, when the U.S. media outlets began to talk about the Assange case, the only thing they had to illustrate it with was the stuff that RT had already shown, which they repeated. What reporting the BBC carried in their article on his hearing left out pertinent details, such as the conflicts of interest of the people involved in the case against Assange. The magistrate Vanessa Barretzer, this is the woman who was strangely moved in to preside over Assange hearing in Britain. She was reportedly elevated from being a magistrate to a magistrate, a local judicial figure, to a judge for this case, and nothing which appears in the article was clearly sourced by a reporter in the courtroom instead of someone listening to reports from people who were there, including John Pilger. The BBC, in other words, fell down completely on its job of giving an account of this remarkable case of railroading of Julian Assange by the British government, clearly at the direction of the American government. Most of the people involved in the courtroom apparently turned out to be American CIA agents and others who were busily telling the British what they wanted to do with this dangerous man, Assange. This case is an international scandal, and it's an international scandal you'll hear much more about in countries other than the United States and Great Britain. Keep your eye open for references to the attempt by the U.S. and the U.K. as their dog's body to kill Julian Assange, which is what they're doing.
So let me carry on here.
Okay.
I don't, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but let me just mention again that Counterpunch carried an article by Robert Fisk about the goings-on in Lebanon, which basically blame Hezbollah. And let me just say in passing, back to Rania Khalek and her coverage of that, and I'll continue to sort of monitor that. Robert Fisk is wrong about Lebanon. He knows a lot about Lebanon. He's been covering it for years, but he's getting lazy, and the Angry Arab has been on his case for years about how lazy he's gotten about covering that.
The Angry Arab is a columnist, a particularly insightful one.
Angry Arab is a handle for formerly a blog and now a Twitter account. Assad Abu Khalil, who also writes on Consortium News and is interviewed on the Real News Network. There'll be more to say about that, but it isn't as nearly simple and silly as Robert Fisk is saying. But again, Louis Proyect goes on about that, and he refers to Robert Fisk on the Marx mail list as finally getting it right, because Louis, in the way these things work, Louis hates Hezbollah because he thinks they've been on, and they have been on Assad's side in Syria, but of course he hates them for that, and that's the way these things just fall out these days.
They're also the only force in the region that is actually, as it were, won against the Israeli military.
Right.
So,
and Louis doesn't care about that anymore. And I don't mean to be obsessed with what Louis is saying, but again, it's in an effort to, the players, the scorecard, the whole thing. Let me also give a shout out, like I did a couple weeks ago, to the podcast What's Left, which is conducted by a couple of very young people named Benjamin Studebaker, who is a Studebaker, and an Australian woman named Amy Therese, Terese, which is doing the best analytical points of view on what's going on, especially with the Democratic Party primaries, especially with critiquing Elizabeth Warren. And you can go back and listen to some of their podcasts about that. And you could also, if you want to get a good critique of a book that Warren wrote many years ago called The Two-Income Trap, you can find a podcast called The Brunigs, and one episode of that dealt with a relatively recent episode, or maybe within the last 3 or 4 months, talked about Matt Brunig, from his policy wonkish point of view, really took apart this book that Elizabeth Warren wrote with her daughter. But in that spirit, let me just read one paragraph. There was a good article on Counterpunch from a fellow I've referred to in the past, Anish Shivani, Shivani, called 5 Questions for Elizabeth Warren. This was on October 25th. And it was written in the form of a letter to Senator Warren. There were 5 points to this. I'm only going to read one of them, which was number 2. Anish Shivani writes, in your 2003 book, The Two-Income Trap, Why Middle-Class Parents Are Going Broke, your sympathies lie with the middle class, playing by the rules, yet often falling by the wayside because of errors in judgment. Your financial planning advice to this fraught middle class presumes the economic playing field as a given, with the individual players needing to be astute and sharp in dealing with forces more powerful than they are, so they can have, quote unquote, more breathing room. As you write, and this is Shivani quoting Warren, we haven't suggested a complete overhaul of the tax structure, and we haven't demanded that businesses cease and desist from ever closing another plant or firing another worker. Nor have we suggested that the United States should build a quasi-socialist safety net to rival the European model. all of these solutions we have proposed thus far, that's in this book, The Two-Income Trap, creating tax incentives for saving, expanding state-funded disability coverage, and encouraging families to insure themselves against an uncertain future can be implemented within America's current blend of public and private systems without drastic changes or massive tax increases, end quote of Elizabeth Warren. And then Shivani goes on, the major thrust of your advocacy in the early 2000s was the idea that the, again, quoting Warren, stay-at-home mom was no longer the family's safety net, end quote. So toward that end, you suggested staying at home or having no children as possible options, while holding that, quote, it is quite possible that the biological drive to pass on your genes will continue to win out over seemingly more rational financial calculations, end quote, of Warren. And so, and in this segment, Shivani concludes his statement with this question, with these two questions. Do finances have to be the ultimate arbiter of life choices? Why not change the rules rather than expect families to learn to better play, but I think he meant to better play the rules or better play
right.
by the rules. So this is typical of what Benjamin Studebaker has been talking about on his podcast, what the Brunigs were talking about on their quasi-socialist podcast. The idea that Warren wants to fix capitalism. Now it's getting to the point where people are seriously arguing that Elizabeth Warren is almost like Bernie Sanders. And these people and we could talk about Sanders and what he really does stand for, but the difference between them in these regards is very clear, has
yes.
always been very clear. Universalist programs versus mean-tested programs. Changing the structure, the general social democratic structure, versus sort of getting people to sort of play better within the capitalist system. Right. And that's what Warren is, and that these people are arguing, and I obviously agree with them, otherwise I wouldn't be going on and on about it. This is going to be several months of Elizabeth Warren obscuring the differences that we have to look forward to now, obscuring the differences between her and Bernie Sanders in order to get enough of the Sanders vote to take the mantle from the fading Joe Biden and to deal with Buttigieg and blah, blah, blah. So
I have a last point here from our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, that caught my eye particularly because a number of members of my family are or have been gamers of one form or another. We played these immensely popular video games, the names of which I barely know. But Jeff points out that the Russiagate enthusiasms of the American political establishment and the propaganda that has generated is now affecting the world of gamers in ways apparently that it has for a good while, but now is doing so even more. An extremely popular game called Call of Duty. I'm sure you've played it all the time. I'm sure.
I'm sure it's a part of become a part of my lifestyle.
It's a video game that makes Russia the new enemy in the game. The game has been around for a while in various forms. It blames Russia for U.S. war crimes, and it hides any blame from its Russian audience. The game is marketed around the world, of course. The addition for non-Russian customers in Europe, U.S., L.A., and so forth, makes Russia the enemy, while it's a war game, while the Russian edition makes some heavy, made-up family the enemy. That is, they become a criminal enterprise around the world, not the United States. The war crimes of the United States are pinned on Russia, and the white helmets, the U.S. stooges that were among other things, working with murderers in Syria and posing the fake death pictures to denigrate the reputation of the Syrian government, which was doing a pretty good job of that on its own. They become the green helmets in the Russian edition of the game. What's remarkable here is that someone has decided, it seems quite correctly, that the influence of the gaming world is as important as any other forms of political influence that we have around the world, and therefore we better make sure that they're telling the right story. The gamers, it presumes, cooperated with the American activities, and we'll need an additional Edward Snowden to tell us how the gaming world was corrupted by the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, what have you.
Yeah, I never let my son play video games, or his parents. Neither of his parents ever let him play video games,
My goodness.
were interested. I mean, he was coming up right when that was becoming a little more popular, and he actually thanks. I think he thanks us for that. I think he has a better life without video games than he's had. But that's an aside to this more important political stuff.
I was very much on the other side. I'm reminded of a New York Times article from the Vietnam era. You have to be from Scarsdale to know how bad it really is. And I had at least one son who spent a good deal of time on the Scarsdale enthusiasms of gaming. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 44th week of 2019, a Wrong Reason edition. We refer to T.S. Eliot's remark applied to the Trump impeachment. Poets often get there first. The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. That is, impeach Donald Trump, not for his war crimes, which are substantial, but for, in fact, quite justifiable activities, including calling on foreign governments that we have installed to check the criminal tendencies of American officials, and indeed to withhold arms from this government, arms that government is using for American foreign policy purposes, and killing people that we want killed.
Carl, if the poets get there first, nice guys finish last.
Well, that may be true too, and there is perhaps no contradiction there. I don't
Perhaps.
know.
We'll talk about that next week.
One last point. There new evidence came up in the Rodney Reed case that I think we mentioned a while ago. Texas is about to kill him for a crime that he probably didn't commit. You'll see on our Facebook page a note of how you might write to the governor of Texas and say killing people is wrong and you shouldn't do it. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.